You're listening to The Narrow Mind, Wednesday, June 20th, show 818, interview with Brian Tallman concerning the question of a biblical theory of just war.
You're traveling through another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and of sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of the imagination. There's a signpost up ahead. Your next stop, The Narrow Mind.
Well, folks, welcome once again to The Narrow Mind. My name is Gene Cook, and I'll be your host for the next 60 minutes. And we've got a controversial show for you today, that's for sure. It's been a while since we've actually had any controversy going on here on The Narrow Mind. It's hard to believe, but it has been a while. I don't think it's probably been at least a month I can think of since we've had something really controversial to talk about. And no doubt today's topic is going to be controversial for many. We're going to be discussing the question of what constitutes a just war, or what is a Christian's theory of just war. And I'm going to be introducing my guest to you in just a moment. Before I do that, I want to let you know once again that I have confirmed my trip to Dallas-Fort Worth. I'm going to be out in Dallas-Fort Worth area on the 20th and 21st of July. And so I am going to be trying to organize some type of get-together for our Narrow Mind listeners out in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so stay posted on that. I'm actually looking for somebody who may have some connections with their church or some type of a facility that maybe can seat 100 people. I'd like to have a get-together, kind of a Narrow Mind addict reunion there, if you will, out in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So if you think that you might be able to host that, let me know. Send me an email. You can send it to unchainedradio@unchainedradio.com. Looking forward to meeting all of our listeners out in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I'll probably be staying in the Fort Worth area, which is the area that the people live that are going to be allowing me to stay at their home. And so anywhere in Dallas-Fort Worth, though, if it's in the Dallas area, Frisco, whatever, Fort Worth, I don't care, because I'm going to be driving around a lot anyway. So just let me know if that's something that you're interested in. We're also going to try to get on one of the local radio stations out there in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and put out the word to people that may even be unfamiliar with the Narrow Mind program. So hopefully we'll have a decent turnout. We're also inviting our atheist friends. I know we've got some atheists out there in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and so we're inviting them also. And I also want to let you know that it's been confirmed. We have 2 debates lined up for the month of August. On August 5th, I will be debating atheist Steve Shawnee, and he will be defending the proposition that atheism is superior to Christianity, which is kind of an interesting proposition. I think I'm going to have some fun with that. And then on the 19th of August, I will be debating Paul Paedo Manata. That's right, Paul the Paedo Baptist. And we will be discussing the question of who are the proper recipients of Christian baptism. Is it us and our newborn babies, or is it those that profess faith in Jesus Christ? That'll be an interesting debate also. In fact, Paul and I have already agreed we're going to sit down in advance and go over some of our arguments and make sure that we understand exactly where we are coming from, so that we don't misrepresent any arguments with straw men type fallacies. And should be a very interesting debate, a precise debate. And as I told Paul, I said, Paul, you better bring your A game. You better be on your A game for this one, because it's one thing to hear those infants crying when the cold water hits their forehead. It's another thing to hear Paedo Baptists sitting around crying because their position wasn't represented in a strong manner. He got a kick out of that. Hopefully you did too. And so I'm all about making enemies, aren't I? I got to realize that at least 50%, if not more, of the Reformed audience out there are Paedo Baptists. So, but I know that we can joke about these things. In fact, my guest today is a Paedo Baptist. I'd like to introduce to you Brian Tallman, the pastor of New Life Presbyterian Church in La Mesa, California. Brian, welcome to The Narrow Mind.
Thanks for having me, Gene. After those comments, however, I'm going to have to cut out, and I'm not going to be able to stay with you. No, I'm just kidding.
We're going to break fellowship, huh? Now, you've heard about the closet pedo, right?
Uh-huh.
Well, I think you're the closet Baptist.
Oh, do you? All right.
But we've never actually discussed that subject between us. So at least
we'll save that for another show, maybe.
Yeah, we will.
Okay.
Yeah, you can, I can have you on after the debate with Paul Manani. You can explain to myself and our listening audience how Paul failed to represent the position properly.
Exactly. I'll be one of those guys crying.
All right, we're going to talk about a very serious subject today. And I've got in fact, if you're listening live, you can go ahead and check out, I've got a very controversial picture on the homepage of Unchained Radio. In fact, I think I'll put this up next to the podcast once we finish the program over there on the Narrow Mind Aftermath blog. But I've got a picture of Osama bin Laden in the old kind of Uncle Sam caricature. And he's saying, I want you to invade Iraq. And many people have said that really the U.S. invading Iraq played right into the hands of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups that are represented by such men as Osama bin Laden. But today we want to do something a little bit different. We want to ask the question, before we even discuss the subject of Iraq, and I'm sure it'll probably come up at some point in our conversation, but we want to discuss the subject of what constitutes a just war. I mean, can we, as a nation, can we pick a fight anytime we want, with anyone we want? So where do we derive our rights? So Brian Tallman, who is a friend of mine, we've been friends for several years now. In fact, the Lord entrusted Brian Tallman to me at the tender age of 27, and I would like to think that I helped shape and mold his brain. Now, Brian's 28 now. Now, how old are you, Brian? 30?
30.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. I'm catching up on you.
Yeah. Pretty soon, people aren't going to be asking you why you're bald.
Yeah, exactly.
No, Brian shaves his head, and so, little joke there. All right, so, Brian, you obviously are a man that holds the Christian scriptures, the 66 books of the Bible, as an authority in your life. And so, as a pastor, as a Christian, when you consider the subject of war, what, in your mind, what constitutes a war? In fact, some would say that war is never an option for Christians. So right. Why don't you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, let me just tell you, if I could just make a couple introductory remarks, and you sort of gave me a good lead-in with that first statement. I do believe that the Scriptures should be the guide for the church and for all of humanity in every single area of life that we face, including warfare and including our national existence. And so, because we're Christians who live both in the kingdom of Christ and then whatever nation we have been placed by God, we have the necessity of opening our Bibles and grappling with whatever issue we're faced with. And that includes dealing with this issue of warfare. And doing some research on this topic and in studying the topic in the past, one of the things that struck me was the fact that for the most part, every document, confession within the Western Church's tradition has a section on warfare and on just warfare. The Catholic Catechism, the Westminster Confession of Faith, which my church holds to, the London Baptist Confession, which your church holds to, and a whole host of other confessions that have been adopted by different denominations, grapple with this subject of warfare. And I am sort of taken back by how little grappling is done in our particular day and age. Calvin and his Institutes, for example, has a whole section on warfare and just war. Luther talked about warfare and just war. Early Christians, Augustine, Aquinas, etc. And so it's important for us to grapple with the subject, to talk about the subject, even though we might come to different conclusions, but for us to really wrestle with it. One other introductory remark that I'd like to make, and that is as a pastor, pastoring a church in America, made up of, if I would guess, although I've never taken a poll, primarily of conservative Republicans, which tends to be the evangelical makeup in this world, as we've seen with recent presidential elections. I am concerned that oftentimes the church equates the church with America. And I am concerned that oftentimes Christians spend more energy and weep and shed more tears for the decay of America instead of shedding tears for the decay of the church. And more Christians study politics rather than studying their Bibles and studying theology. And I want to combat that. I want people to have their Bibles open. And I want people to swear allegiance to Jesus first and foremost, and not necessarily to Jesus and to a nation, although I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but for us to renew our vigor in following Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, no matter what happens to this greatest nation in which we live. One more thing, I oftentimes joke with my wife that sort of illustrates what I've been saying. I oftentimes joke with my wife about what I call the American Trinity as we're driving down the freeway. And the American Trinity is the cars that have the bumper stickers, Bush Cheney, the Jesus fish, and the American flag. And that's sort of, to me, the epitome of the American Trinity, that if you want to become a Christian, you don't only come to Christ, but you also come to the GOP. And I'm not sure that's exactly the case. And so that's why I tackle this issue and wrestle through this issue. I just want to say, too, by the way, that if I've offended Eugene, I know you do have those stickers, and I'm sorry that that's
well, I don't know if you heard, Brian, at the beginning of the show, but I'm planning a trip out to Texas next month.
Right.
And you just basically shot down all hopes of me getting any invites.
Okay. Well, I'm not saying you. Yeah.
That's
okay.
Bush country.
You are. That is Bush country. You're right.
All right. So, what would you say to somebody that says Christians should in no way? Jesus said, if somebody strikes you on your cheek, turn the other cheek. What would you say to them, as far as them using that as a proof text for us not to be involved in warfare, period?
Yeah. Well, you're highlighting one of the main positions within the Christian tradition. Essentially, there's two positions that have variations within them, and that is the position of pacifism and just war theory. The pacifist, which you're alluding to, appeals to Jesus' teaching in Sermon on the Mount that we should turn our other cheek, love our enemy. If they ask for our coat, give them not only our coat, but everything we possess. And so what I would say to that particular person who embraces the pacifist position, which I don't embrace, is that I would say that they are failing to realize that Jesus has given to us both individual ethics and national ethics, and they're confusing the two. And so interpersonal relationships, where you and I, for example, deal with one another, are different from the way that international relationships are played out. Jesus has entrusted the sword, as we're told in Romans chapter 13, to nations, but not to individuals. Therefore, if I am sinned against, it's not my right to retaliate against an individual, but rather to turn the other cheek. But the state can get involved if I have been sinned against or harmed, to protect me and to protect my rights, and that is well within the purview of God's word.
So you're saying then that relationships between two individuals they'd have a different dynamic, a different set of rules than relationships between two nations or the nations and its citizens?
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
And you justify that by citing Romans 13, that God has ordained the governments that exist, and he's given them the prerogative to be the sword of his justice by enforcing capital punishment?
Exactly.
Okay, is that
not just enforcing capital punishment, but also fighting for the defense of its individuals and citizens and the preservation of its national existence.
Okay, and is that the only verse that you have that you can appeal to draw this distinction between relationships between human beings, say neighbors and political institutions?
I'm sure if I had more time, I could probably marshal some others. The difficulty in appealing to the Old Testament in situations like this is that Israel was a theocracy in a way that no nation is today, and so there's a little bit of difficulty in applying those scriptures. But we could appeal to Deuteronomy chapter 20. We could appeal to Deuteronomy chapter 7, wherein God gives rules for warfare. But then also, if you continue to read through the law, you'll find out that there's an obligation for neighbors to love each other, and in fact, for us to love our enemies. And so what I would say is that Jesus is not giving us a new ethic when he tells us to turn the other cheek and love our enemies, but rather he is reiterating and helping us to understand correctly the ethic that is also found in the law. So you see this tension even within the Old Testament under a theocracy, where a nation has the right to wage warfare, but individuals do not possess those rights.
Okay, so in a let's say in a family situation, I'm sure you would agree that the relationship between children and parents is different than the relationship between those two parents.
Oh, most definitely, yes. But they're analogous though as well, because whereas the parents function together as an authority figure to the children, and so they're working corporately, and that's slightly different. But also, the husband does function in an authoritative fashion with his wife as well.
But we're never told to submit to our children.
Never told to submit to our children.
And yet, our children are commanded to submit to the parents
and obey them. That's correct. Okay. Exactly right. So that would be probably a pretty good analogy.
Okay, so what are some groups? I'm thinking of Jehovah's Witnesses that would have no part. They would be considered pacifist.
Right.
Are there any other major denominations or groups that come to mind that hold this position? Yeah,
historically, the Anabaptist tradition, which was present during the Reformation, were pacifists, and flowing out of that tradition, or at least drawing their historical roots to that tradition, we would see groups like the Quakers, George Fox, for example, and his denomination, the Mennonites, the Amish as well would all reject not only warfare, but also would say that it was sinful and wrong for Christians to be engaged in any endeavor with the government. In other words, it would be wrong for you not only to be, say, in the Navy, but it would also be wrong for you to be a police officer, a fireman, etc.
That's just stupid. I mean, that is just ridiculous. How are we going to be, in the world and not functioning as a part of society?
Yeah.
And not only that, but it comes to, I'm trying to think of the example in Scripture where somebody asked Jesus, I think it was a type of a soldier or a police, asked Jesus, what should I do? And Jesus didn't he basically told him to stop embezzling money from people. But he didn't tell him to quit his job.
Right. You're referring to Luke chapter 3.
Right.
And the soldiers likewise demanded of him, saying, "And what shall we do?" And he said to them, "Do violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely, and be content with your wages." We see in Matthew chapter 8, an individual comes to Jesus who is a ruler, or at least sort of like a commander with many soldiers under him. And Jesus actually commends his faith. And we also see, for example, in Acts chapter 10, Cornelius, who was a centurion and part of what is called there an Italian band. But he's also said in that very same verse that he was a man who feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always.
Okay, so Jesus is not a pacifist. In that sense.
I mean, from our, when we're talking about warfare, and Jesus would not be a pacifist at all, no.
And in fact, Jesus, as the second person of the Godhead,
waged war, right?
Endorsed. What was that?
Oh, I thought you were going to say he did wage war against his enemies. But go ahead.
Yeah, he wages war, and that's what the Book of Revelation is about.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he also endorsed the army under Joshua.
Right.
I mean, Joshua was the captain of the Lord's army. He goes in with the endorsement and the undergirding of God himself in conquering his enemies throughout the land of Canaan.
That's correct. Yep.
So God certainly isn't against war. In fact, God gives Israel laws concerning how war is to be conducted, right?
That's correct. Deuteronomy 20, Deuteronomy chapter 7.
So then if somebody comes along and says, well, now it's almost like a dualism, right? Or a type of drawing this sharp dichotomy between the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's at the heart of it. I mean, you can see this is just another fruit of obviously dispensationalism wasn't around when the Anabaptists were around, but it's just another manifestation of this hardcore disconnect between the Old and New Testaments. Yeah.
Okay, so if we rule out pacifism from a biblical standpoint,
and by the way, just very quickly related to that, I mean, it views the Sermon on the Mount as Jesus introducing a radical new teaching,
mm-hmm.
and the view that I embrace, and I think is the right view, is that Jesus is not introducing anything new necessarily on the Sermon on the Mount, but is correcting perversions that had crept in to the thinking of the religious leaders at his time.
Yeah, that would be my position also.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, if we can rule out pacifism then, and we can demonstrate from Scripture that God endorses war, that God, in the person of Christ, and through the apostles, actually commend soldiers and military leaders, then how does a nation determine what wars to get involved in and what wars they shouldn't get involved in?
Right.
I mean, that's the big question, because we as America, we're faced with that question almost on a daily basis with conflicts around the world and certain threats. So what is the guideline then? I mean, how do we know from Scripture what wars we should be involved in and what wars we shouldn't be involved in?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, the question is, should we take up the song, Praise the Lord, and pass the ammunition? Should we adopt the mantra, kill them all and let God sort them out? Or should we look to something that is perhaps a little more sanctified with our Bibles open? And not only sanctified with Bibles open, but also from my standpoint, what I'm primarily going to be limited to here is the history of the church. How is the history of the church adopted and looked at this topic of war? So let me just answer that question first by offering you a quote, and then by giving you the three criteria that have traditionally been presented. Okay.
Okay.
Commenting on the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 23, paragraph 2, which is essentially the same, which is exactly the same, actually, as the London Baptist Confession in that particular place. A. Hodge offered the following exposition. Here's what he said. War is an incalculable evil because of the lives it destroys, the misery it occasions, and the moral degradation it infallibly works on all sides, upon the vanquished and the victor, the party originally in the right and the party in the wrong. In every war, one party at least must be in the wrong, involved in the tremendous guilt of unjustifiable war, and in the vast majority of cases, both parties are in the wrong. No plea of honor, glory or aggrandizement, policy or profit can excuse, much less justify war, nothing short of necessity to the end of the preservation of national existence. In order to make a war right in God's sight, it is not only necessary that our enemy should aim to do us wrong, but also, one, that the wrong he attempts should directly or remotely threaten national existence, and two, that war be the only means to avert it. Even in this case, every other means of securing justice and maintaining national safety should be exhausted before recourse is had to this last resort. A war may be purely defensive in spirit and intent, while it is aggressive in the manner in which it is conducted. The question of right depends upon the former, not the latter, upon the purpose for which, and not upon the mere order in which, or theater upon which, the attack is made. He says a couple things in here that quote, that are important, and I'll just highlight them, and then I'll run to the criteria. The first thing is he says that no plea of honor, glory, or aggrandizement, policy, or profit can excuse or justify war. I think he's alluding there to Cicero, a contemporary living during the first century, who suggested that just war was for defending the national existence and also for defending your honor. And historically, Christians have rejected the latter and embraced the former. That is to say, as Christians, we're not seeking to justify and defend our honor, but rather we seek to defend and justify the national existence and the people who live in that particular nation.
Okay.
He also highlights the fact that nothing short of necessity to the end of the preservation of national existence constitutes a just war, and that it must be purely defensive in spirit. And so that really is the three criteria boiled down to its essence. Now, let me just run through the three criteria, and then I'll let you offer some questions if you have them at this time. The three criteria that have historically been offered by the Church, Augustine laid the foundation, Aquinas built upon that, his superstructure of just war theory. Calvin and Luther and most of the Western Church embraced these three criteria. The first of those criteria is a competent authority. That is to say, what we were talking about earlier, it cannot be an individual, but it has to be a magistrate. It has to be a nation. Okay. Mm-hmm. The second is the proportionality of proposed means and probable costs in the light of the probability of success. In other words, the cure, that is war, should not be worse than the disease, injustice. Okay? So the money spent, the lives that it takes to preserve this or to avert this injustice cannot be worse than what was inflicted upon the particular nation. And then third, there must be just cause. There must be reason for the nation to go against the other nation, i.e. to defend themselves, and it must be proved justly.
Okay. When we come back from our break, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. When we come back, we're going to continue our discussion with Pastor Brian Tallman on the subject of what constitutes a just war.
This is Dr. Bob Morey, and I have to come to Addicts Anonymous. I come before you faced with an addiction that I simply can't overcome. I am addicted to Gene Cook's Unchained radio program, and I just simply can't kick the habit. But this is an addiction to which I invite you. One injection possibly will lead to your addiction as well.
I want to remind you to go ahead and subscribe to the Narrow Mind Update email group. You can do that by just clicking on the green mailbox there on the homepage at unchainedradio.com, and that'll keep you up to date. In fact, I sent out a last-minute announcement this morning concerning today's program and tomorrow's program, since we made some changes at the last minute, and I was able to get Pastor Brian to come on. So I want to invite you to subscribe to that. Also, I want to remind you that our May special is still going. We're not calling it the June special because we're too lazy to change the website. But the May special for $39.99, you can get an annual subscription to the archive at unchainedradio.com, and you will also get a high-quality podcast feed. So if you listen to the show via podcast, you're actually getting the low-quality podcast if you're listening to it for free. In addition to that, you'll get a book, my book, the only book that I've written, entitled The Baptism Cult, a exposition on or an expose, rather, of the International Church of Christ. It has all the scriptures in there to refute this idea that we are regenerated through water baptism. All right, Pastor Brian, you still with me?
I'm still here.
All right, question. Now, you gave several criteria. You gave three criteria for war. Number one, it has to be by the magistrate. It can't be like, private citizens. There should be some equality in the effort that is imposed that is somehow equal to or close to the damage that has been done or the threat that's been done. And then thirdly, just cause. There has to be a just cause to go to war. Now, I didn't hear you quote any Bible verses. I heard you quote Augustine and Calvin and the Westminster Confession and We have a lot of listeners that really want to hear it from the Scripture. I mean, it's good that we have some church history here to fall back on, but really, as you and I would both agree, our ultimate authority is going to be the Scriptures.
That's right.
So, do we have any Scripture?
We do. I mean, the first.
I got to keep you honest here, brother, because I agree with your position, but I'm going to get some email from people saying, that disagree with us, saying, oh, well, the reason why you arrive at those conclusions is because you ditch the Bible. Right.
Well, I mean, let me just say that ultimately my research has been primarily limited to historical understanding of just war.
Okay.
So, and the difficulty too that comes when we talk about this particular subject is that we can't go to like a section of Scripture that says here are the three. I mean, we're taking the whole Bible, and we are trying to bring Christian principles upon this particular subject. Having said that, I mean, I think that Romans chapter 13 gives to us this idea of competent authority, that it needs to be a magistrate and not an individual. We talked about that. The idea that you can't just go and bomb, for example, I'll just lay it out there. You can't drop an atomic bomb on somebody and kill, hundreds of thousands of civilians. That doesn't equate the injustice that was done to you. Would be based upon the Old Testament understanding and the Old Testament law that when you execute justice as a magistrate, it needs to be proportionate to the crime that was committed. So, for example, we're told in the Scriptures that there needs to be an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a bruise for bruise, etc. And so you can't, if I come to you and I kick your car door in and I make a big dent in your car, you can't come and burn my house down. That's not fair. And nor can the magistrate come and say, well, you kicked Jane's door in, you need to now sell your house and give him all the money. That's just not fair. If I kick your door in, I need to replace the door. There needs to be a proportionate response. And that again is based upon the idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth that we find not only in the Old Testament but also in Jesus' words. Exodus 21:24, Leviticus 24:20, Deuteronomy 19:21, and of course Jesus reiterates the principle in Matthew chapter 5. And then this idea of just cause also rests in an understanding of the magistrate being entrusted with the sword and therefore has a responsibility to defend its citizens, to preserve their national identity as God has granted to them, as God has ordained for every nation to exist at this particular time.
Okay. So Nagasaki, Hiroshima, did we go a little bit too far there?
Oh, I think so,
in your opinion?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was just, it was overkill. No pun intended, but it was too much. Now it did bring it into the war, but and I'm not a historian and American warfare, so I can't get into all the details with you. But from what I do know, that was just over the top.
All right. So the big question is, our country is currently engaged in a war. I'm not real clear on who the enemy is in the war. Yeah. And I think part of the problem is that our military is not real clear on who the enemy is in the war.
Yeah.
But we went into Iraq. We invaded Iraq, and we took down the leader, Saddam Hussein, removed him from his post, and actually he ran and hid in a hole, but then we eventually found him. But and then brought him up on charges, and we know the rest of the story. He was found guilty. So did we have, according to the criteria here that you've laid out in these 3 points, equality, magistrate, and just cause, is this war that's taking place in Iraq, is it a just war, biblically speaking?
Yeah, well, I would say that we are currently involved in a war that meets criteria number 1 So we have the competent authority is waging war. It's not like you and I are going over there and picking up sticks and going after people. We have our military over there. So that meets that criteria. I would argue that the cure in this particular case is worse than the disease from the standpoint of the lives that have been expended and the money that has been lost in order to fund this particular endeavor, and also argue that there was not just cause and that it wasn't by nature a defensive war.
So
I guess that answer is no.
Okay, so I'm trying to understand this in my mind.
Okay.
What would have had to have happened for the war then to be justified? I mean, because there is the theory that we were bombed on 9/11, right? We basically took a hit on our home soil, and the government of Iraq was a place that was harboring or allowing the training of these Al-Qaeda cells to take place. And in addition to that, the leader, Saddam Hussein, was ignoring agreements that had been brought about through the United Nations resolutions in allowing weapons inspections and basically getting rid of all of his, if I understand the issues correctly, getting rid of all of his weapons of mass destruction. And so couldn't somebody make the case that Saddam Hussein was indirectly involved in the bombing that took place because he was allowing Al-Qaeda to move and work freely within his country?
Yeah. Well, let me give you 5 reasons why I don't think that it meets specific reasons as it applies to Iraq, and then I'll let you ask me questions. But I'll also tell you that, I mean, you've touched on the rub, here's the rub. You've touched on the crux of the issue. And that is, frankly, how do we understand the evidence? And what I found is that it depends on your, and you'll like this, but it depends on your presupposition, how you read.
Okay.
What?
If you have a D or an R next to your name, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I have neither of those next to my name, so I guess maybe that I think I'm in a place where I can evaluate it properly. But no, I think it depends on your presuppositions how you evaluate the evidence. The other thing too that makes this difficult is the fact that you hit the nail on the head. It's a war on terror. Mm-hmm. So it's a war specifically on terrorists and not against nations. It would have been so much easier if these guys were Iraqi soldiers. Then I wouldn't even be having this conversation with you. But these are individuals not aligning themselves, at least I would argue, with a particular nation, but rather with a particular ideology and group, and that makes it difficult. So let me just give you the criteria or the 5 reasons why it fails to meet the just war criteria, and then you can ask me some questions on that. Okay. The first reason that I don't think it meets the criteria for a defensive war and a just war, and this is often, and you touched on this a little bit, is it's often suggested that Iraq failed to comply with UN sanctions. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that does not justify the United States' involvement for a couple reasons. First of all, Greg Bonson has said it so well. He says the United States tends to use the UN like a taxi. When it's heading in our direction, we hop on and we say it's the best thing ever. When it's going in a direction we're not going, we condemn it. And so the United Nations has no sway, no authority, no moral or ethical authority has been given by God to the United Nations, but has been rather given to nations. Mm-hmm. Secondly, if we adopt this logic, and this is what I love to remind people of, if we adopt the logic that we're going after Iraq because they failed to comply to United Nations resolutions, then we must also be consistent and now turn our guns on Israel, who continues to exist in noncompliance to UN resolutions with respect to occupied territory.
Brian, did I mention that I was going to Texas next month? We're talking about the Texas mega churches, man. They send all kinds of money over there to Israel. You can't be talking about Israel like that. Israel is Brian, Israel has to be allowed to violate UN sanctions, okay?
Okay. As long as we're clear on that.
Because they're God's people. They're Israel, okay?
Right,
they
exactly.
can do
well, it just shows you, again, the dispensational hermeneutic at work, but that's another issue.
Did I mention Dallas Theological Seminary?
You're speaking there, right?
I wanted to visit the library while I was there.
Yeah, you're speaking there, aren't you? There's going to be a big poster of your face.
They're going to hang me when I get there.
Do not enter.
Okay, so, number two, if we're going to be consistent, you said, then we would also have to fight with Israel.
That's right.
And we know that's not going to happen.
That's right. And then let me also just read you what Colin Powell said. Colin Powell on February 5th, 2003, before the United Nations, in defense of going in against Iraq, offered this defense to the United Nations. We know that Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction. He's determined to make more. Given Saddam Hussein's history of aggression, given what we know of his terrorist associations, and given his determination to exact revenge on those who oppose him, should we take the risk that he will not someday use these weapons at a time and the place and in the manner of his choosing at a time when the world is in a much weaker position to respond? The United States will not and cannot run that risk to the American people. Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option, not in a post-September 11 world. Now, obviously, we know now that Saddam Hussein didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. And I think, for me, that pretty much seals the deal. He was a man who made a lot of threats, and he was somebody who wanted everybody to think that he had weapons, but he actually had nothing.
But we thought he had weapons.
We thought he had weapons, that's correct.
And you're saying that doesn't justify taking action, taking offensive action? I'm being facetious here, Brian.
No. Let me give you an example, though. I have a 2-year-old daughter. Let's say you come over to my house, and let's say that she was extremely precocious and that she could speak in long sentences. And you walked into my door, and she said, if you don't get out of my house, I'm going to kick your butt.
Mm-hmm.
And you kicked her, and you started punching her. Now, that wouldn't be right. How is she going to kick your butt? She's a little 2-year-old girl, right?
Yeah.
But she has made threats against you say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just because somebody makes threats against you doesn't necessarily give you the right to go ahead and destroy them.
Okay, so then I guess the next question would be, what is the proper response? I mean, what if we can't speculate about what our enemies are going to do to us, if that doesn't justify us taking an offensive posture and engaging in preemptive strikes, then what is do we have to just sit around and wait for them to do something to us?
No, we can take preemptive strikes to defend ourselves. I'm not opposed to preemptive strikes, but I'm opposed to preemptive strikes when our research hasn't been properly done. And you'll remember that we essentially went against what the rest of the world was telling us we should do, and that is wait and do more research, wait and see.
So what kind of a preemptive strike would be justified then, in your mind?
A preemptive strike, anything that's necessary to protect a particular nation and national existence. So let's say, for example, Iran says that on Friday they're going to launch nuclear weapons against us.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is fine, assuming that we can prove that they actually have nuclear weapons, to target those weapons and destroy all of them before Friday.
Okay, but that's not analogous to the example that you gave of your daughter?
It's not analogous because they have the power to do so.
Okay.
Now, if they didn't have nuclear weapons, but they said that they were going to do it, then that would be wrong for us to bomb them in the Stone Age.
So that would be, if they came out and said that, essentially that would be a declaration of war.
Exactly.
Okay. So even if it might look as though it's preemptive, but it's also a defensive measure.
Exactly. And so, we went into Iraq the first time in order to protect Kuwait, which was, in my opinion, not just as well. We went in, we're told, and I'll just run through a couple of the reasons that we've been given. It basically changed from month to month leading up to 2003 when people went before the UN. But we were told that we needed to go on to Iraq so that we could have a regime change, that we needed to preclude the development of nuclear weapons, that we needed to get the stockpiles of conventional and biological weapons. But most importantly, and this has been the mantra throughout, is that the U.S. had a duty to rescue people from Iraq and a brutal tyrant. I'll be right up front. Saddam Hussein was a brutal tyrant. I mean, he didn't earn the title Butcher of Baghdad for no reason. But God has not entrusted the United States to be the savior of the world. God has called the United States to protect the United States people. And I'm concerned that much of our military action belies a messianic complex.
Okay, well, nobody would say that the United States is sanctioned by God to be the savior of the world. But how about the police of the world? I mean,
right.
You know, we're the free nation. We've got the system that is. I mean, this is the best place on earth to live. Don't we want to share this with our neighbors?
Right.
Even if they don't want it.
Yeah, even if they don't want it. Yeah, assuming that God has ordained a democracy too, which is also another topic. But it's interesting that we're trying to foist a democracy upon Iraq.
So we see ourselves as the good guys.
Exactly, the liberators, like you said, the policemen. You know, if you want nuclear weapons, come check with us first, and we'll tell you if you're allowed to have it.
So we've got nuclear weapons. That's no secret.
That's right.
But we're saying we're going to decide, because we're the good guys, we're going to decide who else gets nuclear weapons.
That's exactly right. We're going to regulate really the rest of the world.
And now you've got North Korea and Iran, who are in the process of developing nuclear weapons. But I don't think that we're going to be rushing into Iran or North Korea anytime soon, like we did in Iraq.
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
I said I don't foresee us as a nation rushing into Iran or North Korea anytime soon.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and that's part of, in my opinion, the hypocrisy of it. Let me just also tell you one other problem, and we're getting off a little bit, but I think this is relevant, is that if we were going in to liberate a people, and if we were going in to bring regime change, how can we sleep at night knowing that thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are being murdered and millions of people are being displaced from their homes in Darfur? And yet we don't even go and do anything there. And yet we're going to go and do a regime change in a country that pales in comparison to.
Is there a connection with our Zionist dispensational mentality?
You know, I don't know. I've really, to be perfectly honest with you, I've rejected the temptation to even go down the road of oil and Israel.
It seems pretty obvious, though. I mean, there's no oil and there's no Israel over there in Africa.
Well, I mean, those are two glaring points, and
Iraq, you know, they have shot Scuds historically at Israel.
Yeah. Yep.
And they'd probably still be doing it today if Saddam Hussein was still in power.
That's true.
So you mentioned a moment ago that you even feel that us going into rescue Kuwait was a mistake.
Yes.
Now, didn't Kuwait ask for our help?
They did ask for our help, but that still does not, by necessity, mean that we can go in and sort of wage warfare with anybody that asks for our help. You know, if they want to swear allegiance to the United States and become part of the United States, fine, then we have an obligation to protect them. But God has not given us the responsibility, in my opinion, to run around the world and to protect everybody who's in need. So the Darfur example, I'm not saying that we should necessarily do that as a nation. I am saying that the church should step up and try to find a way to get that situation fixed, and the church perhaps should have stepped in and tried to alleviate the suffering that was taking place in Kuwait. But
so ideally, we should say to a nation like Kuwait, Kuwait says, hey, you need to come help us. Saddam Hussein has invaded us, And we should say to them, well, would you like to become part of the United States? And if so, okay, we'll think about coming and helping you.
Exactly.
It seems that would put the whole, I mean, that's going to sound crazy to most people. But why are we willing to invest American lives and American tax dollars,
$8 billion a month,
in something that doesn't even belong to us?
Right.
And essentially, what's even more interesting is if you look at the Constitution of Iraq, it is extremely Muslim.
Yeah.
So now we're actually going to be trying to liberate the people of Iraq so that they can reestablish a Muslim government.
That's right.
Which that ain't no democracy, that's for sure.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, that's troubling to say the least.
So are you saying then that we should, because this is what I'm thinking, that we should actually spend our money and our resources on strengthening ourselves in the event that we have a nation come against us?
Yes, but I would also say that, what do we have? We have 100,000 troops deployed in Iraq or something like that, and we're spending $8 billion a month, and that's about $100 billion a year. What I would have been totally for is searching every single cave in Pakistan and finding Osama bin Laden and killing him. And whether it was in warfare or whether it was under trial, like Saddam Hussein went through. And I think, I think you would agree with me, that we could search a lot of caves for $100 billion a year.
I think so too.
Okay, and so that's what I would say. I think we should. We have special forces for a reason. Why don't we get more special forces, equip them to hunt out and destroy every single member of Al Qaeda? And I just don't think that that's taking place with the regime change.
So it seems that we've got ourselves in a predicament now as a nation that is irreparable.
Yeah, I mean, I just talked to somebody who's close to me who was many years in the military, and he's actually taking a different position than I take. But he said we need to be prepared to be there for 20 years.
Yeah. General Petraeus just said 10 to 12.
Oh, did he say that?
Week,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't catch that.
Yeah, just last week I heard that on the news. So now let me kind of shift gears here because we've only got a couple of minutes left. Some would hear your statements and consider you to be anti-American.
Right.
How would you answer that charge?
I would say that I am first and foremost a Christian, and I would say that I am thankful for the freedoms that God has given to me through the United States to be able to speak, for us to be able to even have this conversation and be able to sleep tonight and not think that I'm going to be hunted down and dragged into court. So I'm very thankful for that. I would say that I have many people in my congregation who serve in the military, serve in the police, on the police force, serve in government positions, and I, with as clear voice I can say it, think that America is the greatest nation in the world, and am very thankful to God for being able to be an American. I would also just say that if America were to fall off the globe tomorrow, or if I was forced to be deported or something like that, it wouldn't change my faith.
Okay, and is it possible to hold the view that you hold and still, to some degree, be supportive of our troops that are over there? Because some would say that you are this position undermines the very lives of our military, whether or not you agree with us being there or not. Are you in any degree able to support our troops?
I think I can support them on an individual basis. And
do you pray? Do you encourage people to pray for our military?
To pray for our military? In what sense?
I mean, for their safety and their well-being, and that they'll be returned home, their success.
Well, see, I have a hard time.
That's a good question, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think we're just about out of time.
Yeah, we are out of time.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe you and I can talk about this later and off the air. But that raises another question about holy war and religious war and all that kind of stuff. So.
Okay, Brian, I really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us today, our listening audience of the Narrow Mind. And also, now you and I are going to be meeting at 2 p.m. for a burrito.
That's right.
And then we're going to follow that up with a cigar at the Liberty Tobacco Shop next door, right?
That's correct.
All right, I'm looking forward to that. Thanks for being with me again. Say hello to your wife for me.
I will, my brother. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye. All right, folks. I got a feeling that we're going to have an exciting Open Phones Friday this week. If you want to discuss, I saw some people calling. We weren't taking any calls today, so we allowed the calls just to go to our voicemail. But if you want to discuss this subject, and you might want to listen in tomorrow also, because we're going to have another guest on tomorrow that's going to be discussing something that John MacArthur recently said, and we're going to be talking about that. It's along the same lines of our submission and our obedience to governments as Christians. Some Christians, live in Muslim nations. To what degree are they supposed to submit to those ungodly forms of government as Christians? So we'll be talking to Steve Klein tomorrow morning. That's Thursday morning at 10 a.m. here on The Narrow Mind. Well, we're out of time. I want to thank you again for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. I guess it is afternoon now. It's 2 minutes after 12. And until next time, may the Lord continue to bless the study of His Word.